through the blinding, screaming heart of a Dakota blizzard, for abandoned sisters saw them, Comanche warriors, materializing like death itself from the swirling white. Mary, the eldest, clutched her feverish youngest sister, Annie, her own heart a knot of pure, cold terror. This was the end their father had always preached, the brutal reckoning on these unforgiving plains. Their parents were days overdue, swallowed by the storm, hope buried deeper than any snowdrift. But as the grim-faced warriors drew near, their feathered lances stark against the gray, their first action wasn't the expected savagery. It was a shocking move, a gesture so unexpected it would unravel a dangerous deception and forge an alliance no one, least of all the terrified girls bracing for death, could ever have foreseen. Before the endless snow and the gnawing fear, life on the Carlson homestead had been a testament to toil and simple faith. Thomas and Martha Carlson, their parents, were carved from the resilient heartwood of the frontier, their small cabin a pocket of warmth in a vast, untamed land. Mary, barely a woman at 18, carried the weight of early responsibility with a quiet grace that masked a fiercely observant nature. She missed little, her mind always sifting, assessing. She'd learned to read the unspoken anxieties in her father's eyes, the subtle tightening of her mother's jaw that signaled worries too heavy for words. Sarah, just 2 years younger, possessed a sharper edge, her wit quick and her gaze piercing. She was the practical one, her hands never idle, her mind quick to find solutions or flaws. Emily, the dreamer of the family, filled her days with quiet imaginings, her innocence a fragile bloom in the harsh landscape. And then there was little Annie, barely 6, a spark of pure sunshine whose laughter, now silenced by sickness, had been the melody of their home. Thomas Carlson, a good man devoted to his family, lived under the shadow of a deep-seated dread, the Comanche. His fireside tales, meant as warnings, painted pictures of relentless warriors, of raids that left only sorrow. He would often say, his hand resting near his rifle, that they understood only strength, that one must never show weakness, never trust an Indian. These words were burned into Mary's memory, a constant thrum of unease, whenever her gaze drifted towards the distant, hazy hills that marked Comanche territory. Martha, her spirit gentler, often tried to temper his harsh pronouncements, speaking softly of shared lands and the possibility of understanding. Yet, even her quiet optimism had seemed to dim in the weeks before their departure for Redemption Gulch. A new name, Blackwood, had begun to circulate. A speculator with a voracious appetite for land, his methods whispered to be ruthless. Thomas and Martha had ridden out to secure their deed, to protect their small claim from such encroaching greed, and to gather vital winter supplies. A palpable tension had filled the cabin before they left, an unspoken feeling that this journey was more than a routine trip. It felt heavy with consequence. Thomas and Martha Carlson had mounted their horses as dawn painted the sky, the animals' breath pluming in the crisp air. Thomas had placed a hand on Mary's shoulder, telling her she was in charge, to keep her sisters safe, promising their return in 2 days, 3 at most. Martha had embraced each girl, her eyes lingering on Annie, whispering for them to be good, a strange smile not quite reaching her eyes. Then they were gone, 2 figures dwindling over the rise, leaving an unnerving silence in their wake. The first day of their absence crawled by, filled with chores and Mary's forced attempts at cheerfulness. The second dawned under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. By midday, the wind began to keen, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. Mary felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, her father's tales of sudden, deadly blizzards echoing in her mind. Night fell, and they had not returned. The snow was a relentless curtain now. The third day brought only the blizzard, a raging white beast that clawed at the cabin, rattling the door, shrieking through every chink in the logs. The world outside dissolved into a suffocating, swirling whiteness. Mary struggled to keep the fire alive, but an unnatural cold seeped into the small room. Annie began to cough, a harsh, dry sound that chilled Mary to the bone. Sarah, her face grim, took stock of their meager provisions, her quiet report that it wouldn't last long hanging heavy in the air. Emily, subdued, scratched pictures of her parents returning under a bright sun onto a piece of slate, a stark, painful contrast to the howling fury outside. Days bled into a week, the storm a relentless tormentor. The wind never paused its mournful dirge. Snowdrifts climbed the cabin walls, sealing the windows, entombing them. The woodpile shrank with terrifying speed. Mary instituted strict rationing for fuel and food, a whisper of flour for watery gruel, a few carefully counted beans. Hunger became a constant, dull ache, a hollow companion. Annie's cough deepened, and a dangerous flush stained her pale cheeks. Hope, once a resilient flicker, was now a fragile, guttering flame, threatened by the storm's icy breath. The terrible certainty that their parents were not coming began to solidify in Mary's heart, as cold and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath the snow. The blizzard held them captive in its frozen fist, an unyielding siege upon their small sanctuary. Snow, sculpted by the merciless wind into monstrous shapes, climbed the rough-hewn walls, transforming their home into a silent, frigid crypt. The single window was an opaque white square, a constant reminder of their isolation, of being buried alive. Mary, her face a pale mask of exhaustion, moved with a deliberate calm she fought to maintain. She measured out their dwindling supplies, with the care of a desperate alchemist, trying to stretch moments into days. Her own stomach twisted with a persistent, gnawing emptiness, an ache she steadfastly ignored, her focus solely on her sisters. Sarah, her usual bright spark dimmed by the oppressive weight of their situation, watched Mary with shadowed, knowing eyes. She noted the almost imperceptible tremor in Mary's hands as she carefully banked the fire each night, trying to conserve every last twig. She saw how Mary's already small portions of food grew even smaller. Emily, usually a fount of stories, now sat for hours by the feeble fire, her small face pinched with an anxiety too large for her years, tracing listless patterns in the soot on the hearth. Little Annie's failing health was a constant, piercing dread. Her fever raged, and her tiny, frail body was racked by coughing spells that stole her breath and left her limp with exhaustion. Mary cradled her for hours, humming the lullabies their mother used to sing, the melodies thin and fragile against the storm's roar. The only sounds from the world beyond their walls were the ceaseless, violent shriek of the wind and, more terrifying still, the occasional distant, mournful howl of wolves, drawn by the scent of despair, or perhaps just as trapped and desperate as they. Each cry sent a fresh wave of cold fear through Mary. Her gaze would invariably drift to the corner where her father's heavy Winchester rifle leaned. Its cold, blued steel was a grim testament to the dangers her father had anticipated, dangers that now seemed to be closing in from every direction. She had checked its load more than once, her fingers clumsy with the unfamiliar weight, the thought of actually needing to use it a profound, sickening terror. In the long, suffocating hours of darkness, when the wind sounded like the wails of lost souls, her father's chilling tales of the Comanche returned with renewed force. Images of fierce, painted warriors sweeping across the plains, leaving only destruction, preyed on her mind. Mary fought to banish them, but they flickered in the shadowy corners of the cabin, feeding on their growing fear. Every creak of the straining timbers, every particularly savage gust against the door, morphed into the imagined thud of approaching hoofbeats, the whisper of a feathered headdress just beyond the walls. The isolation was a crushing weight, pressing down, suffocating what little courage remained. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone, adrift in a world that had become a frozen, white hell. Mary knew, with a stark, brutal clarity, that if rescue didn't arrive soon, their chances were fading with every snowflake, with every rasping breath Annie took. The fire was now a pathetic huddle of embers, casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar objects into monstrous shapes. It offered little comfort against the insidious cold that had seeped into their very bones. Their world had contracted to this single, frigid room, the air thick with the smell of stale wood smoke and the faint, sweetish scent of Annie's fever. The child lay on a makeshift bed of blankets, her breathing alarmingly shallow, her small face waxy and pale beneath the fever's unnatural flush. Each faint exhale was like a nail driven into Mary's heart. She had exhausted her repertoire of remedies, cool cloths, sips of water, whispered promises of spring, but the fever clung to Annie with malevolent tenacity. Desperation was no longer a creeping dread, but a palpable entity in the room, cold and sharp. Mary faced the chilling truth. They were losing. The storm, starvation, sickness. One of them would claim Annie, and then, inexorably, the others. A spark of defiance, a raw refusal to simply surrender, flickered within Mary. They had to see outside. Perhaps the storm was finally breaking. Perhaps there was a sign, any sign at all. Bundling herself and Sarah in every tattered scrap of wool and quilt they possessed, they fought the cabin door open against a newly drifted bank of snow. A blast of wind, laden with fine, stinging ice crystals, assaulted them. The porch was a deep hollow carved into a colossal drift, the roof above groaning ominously under an impossible weight of snow. They stood blinking against the painful white glare, the wind tearing at them, whipping their hair across their faces. The world was a churning, featureless ocean of white. The blizzard still raged, though perhaps, Mary thought with a flicker of false hope, with a fraction less ferocity. It was Sarah who spotted them. Her mittened hand shot out, her fingers digging into Mary's arm like talons, her voice a strangled whisper as she pointed. Mary looked. Through a momentary, cruel parting in the swirling snow devils that danced across the desolate landscape, they emerged. Not rescuers. Not the answer to Mary's desperate, silent prayers. A line of dark, mounted figures, materializing like vengeful spirits from the white chaos. Their forms were indistinct at first, blurred by the driving snow, but as they drew inexorably closer, details sharpened into terrifying focus. Lean, wiry ponies, picking their way through the deep drifts with an uncanny sureness. Riders cloaked in dark furs and blankets, their faces shadowed, but the cold gleam of metal, a rifle barrel, the cruel head of a lance, was unmistakable. Feathers, stark and ominous against the bruised gray sky, adorned a warrior's braided hair. Comanche. A dread colder than the wind itself seized Mary, her breath catching in her throat. Every horror story her father had recounted, every nightmare that had ever stalked her sleep, coalesced into this single, devastating moment. This was it. The end. No escape. No possibility of mercy. They were trapped, exposed. 2 girls and 2 sick, helpless children, facing what could only be a war party. Sarah stood frozen beside her, her eyes wide with a terror that perfectly mirrored Mary's own. They had braced for the worst, and the worst, it now seemed, had just ridden out of the very heart of the storm to claim them. The Comanche warriors advanced with a silent, terrifying purpose, their ponies navigating the treacherous, snow-choked terrain with an almost preternatural grace. The distance between them and the 2 girls, frozen on the porch, shrank with alarming speed. Mary's mind was a maelstrom of her father's warnings, the images he'd painted of savage fury, and the stark, brutal reality unfolding before her. She could feel Sarah's body trembling violently beside her, could hear Emily's small, terrified whimper from within the dubious shelter of the cabin. Annie's labored, shallow breathing seemed to echo the frantic, suffocating rhythm of her own heart. This was the moment she had feared above all others, the ultimate test of her strength, and she felt utterly, hopelessly unprepared. The lead rider, a man whose very posture radiated a raw, indomitable authority, reined in his pony a mere dozen paces from the porch. His face, weathered by countless seasons into a mask of stoic endurance, was framed by long, dark braids. His eyes, like chips of polished obsidian, seemed to pierce through Mary, assessing her fear, her desperation, her very soul. He wore no visible war paint, yet his profound stillness, The sheer intensity of his presence was more intimidating than any blood-curdling war cry. This was Kills Two Moons, a name that would later etch itself into their lives with a wholly different meaning. But in that moment, he was simply the grim embodiment of their deepest, most primal fears. No arrow was knocked to a bowstring. No rifle was raised in open threat. The warriors arrayed behind him sat their ponies with a similar, unnerving, watchful stillness. The silence, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the eaves and Annie's faint, distant cough, stretched taut, almost to the breaking point. Mary braced herself, expecting a harsh command, a brutal gesture, the swift, violent beginning of the end. Instead, Kills Two Moons dismounted, his movements fluid, economical, and deliberate. He spared the terrified girls on the porch no more than a fleeting, dismissive glance. His gaze, intense and focused, swept over the snow-choked landscape, towards the faint, almost obliterated track leading in the direction of Redemption Gulch, the path her parents had taken into oblivion. He stood there for a long, charged moment, a figure carved from the very granite of the plains, his expression utterly unreadable. Then he turned back, his dark, piercing eyes fixing directly on Mary. She flinched involuntarily, her muscles coiling, ready for an impact that didn't come. He reached slowly, with no sudden movement, into a worn leather pouch at his belt. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Was this it? A knife? A weapon to seal their fate? Instead, his strong, weathered fingers emerged holding a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its painted wings faded and chipped, but instantly, heartbreakingly, recognizable. Mary gasped, a choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. It was her mother's. Martha Carlson had carried that little bird, a keepsake from her own mother, for as long as Mary could remember. It was a symbol of home, of love, of everything precious they had lost. Kills Two Moons held it out, not as a macabre trophy, but as something else entirely. He began to speak, his voice low and guttural, a cadence unfamiliar and unsettling. He used a mixture of Comanche words, a few clipped, broken English phrases, and a series of expressive, unambiguous hand gestures. He pointed towards the carved bird clutched in his hand, then gestured decisively towards the trail her parents had taken. He made a clear motion depicting a wagon, then a swift, violent gesture of attack, of ambush. His hand swept wide to indicate the attackers, but then he shook his head with sharp emphasis, tapping his own chest, and then sweeping his hand towards his impassive warriors. Not Comanche, he stated, the two English words falling like stones into the silence. He then pointed to the snow-covered ground, mimicking the shape of large, heavy boot prints, clearly distinct from the softer outline of the moccasins his own people wore. White man, he declared, his gaze locked on Mary, his expression conveying a grim, unshakable certainty. The Comanches hadn't been hunting the sisters. They had found the wreckage of her parents' wagon days before and had been meticulously tracking the men responsible, white men, whose tracks led away from the scene of the brutal ambush, not west towards Comanche territory, but east, towards the settlements. The world under Mary's feet seemed to tilt and shimmer. The enemy she had been conditioned to fear, the savage specter of her nightmares, was not the enemy at all. The revelation hung in the frigid, biting air, stunning Mary into a disbelieving silence. The small wooden bird, her mother's cherished talisman, now held in the calloused hand of this stoic Comanche warrior, was irrefutable, heartbreaking proof. Her parents hadn't been lost to the unforgiving storm, nor had they fallen victim to a Comanche raid as her father had so often and vividly warned. They had been attacked, ambushed, by white men, perhaps even by the very men they were riding to meet, or at least, men from that settled world. Kills Two Moons continued his stark narrative, his words and gestures painting a grim, undeniable picture. His warriors had discovered the ransacked wagon, the provisions stolen, the horses driven off. There were clear signs of a brief, desperate struggle. And the tracks, the unmistakable tracks of shod horses and heavy, hobnailed boots, leading not west into the open, windswept plains, but east, back towards the so-called civilization of the settlements, towards Redemption Gulch. Kills Two Moons then spoke a name, or rather, a description that Mary, her mind racing, pieced together with chilling clarity. He described a white chief in the town, one who desired all the land, who paid bad men to scare honest settlers, to drive them from their claims. He made a forceful gesture of pushing, of clearing out. His people, the Nermurna, the true people, as they called themselves, had also suffered greatly from this unseen man's insatiable greed. Their traditional hunting grounds were being systematically encroached upon, their sacred sites desecrated. The men who had attacked her parents, Mary realized with a sickening lurch, were not just random outlaws. They were almost certainly hired enforcers, ruthless thugs carrying out the orders of this grasping power in Redemption Gulch. The name Blackwood, unspoken by the Comanche but screaming in Mary's mind, fit the terrifying description perfectly. A strange, almost surreal sense of calm began to settle over Mary, displacing the raw terror. The immediate, visceral fear of the Comanches had been supplanted by a cold, burgeoning anger and a desperate, dawning sliver of hope. These warriors, these men she had been taught to see as inhuman savages, were not her enemies. They were something else entirely. Potential allies? The thought was staggering, almost blasphemous, yet it resonated with a strange logic. Kills Two Moons looked towards the snow-drifted cabin, his gaze lingering on the thin, pathetic wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. He saw their desperate plight, their isolation, their vulnerability. He then made a gesture towards his warriors, then towards the distant, snow-shrouded horizon, offering them shelter, food. His winter camp, he indicated with signs, was not far, perhaps a day's hard ride if they could manage it through the deep, clinging snow. Mary looked at Sarah, whose face was a canvas of shock, disbelief, and a slowly dawning, reluctant understanding. She thought of Emily, huddled terrified inside, and of Annie, her fragile life dimming with each shallow, rasping breath. To trust these men, these Comanches her father had so vehemently reviled, went against every ingrained instinct, every fiber of her upbringing. But what other choice did they truly have? To remain here meant certain, slow death from cold, starvation, and sickness. To go with them, it was a terrifying leap into the vast unknown, a dangerous, desperate gamble, but it was also, perhaps, their only flicker of a chance. Not just for survival, but for answers, for justice for her parents. Mary swallowed hard, her throat dry. "My little sister," she managed, her voice hoarse, pointing a trembling finger towards the cabin. "She is very sick." Kills Two Moons nodded slowly, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. Or perhaps it was just a trick of the shifting light. He spoke briefly to one of his warriors, a younger man, who dismounted and approached the cabin, not with overt aggression, but with a cautious, observant curiosity. Mary's heart leaped into her throat, but she held her ground, her gaze locked on the warrior. He peered inside for a moment, then stepped back, speaking rapidly in his own tongue to his leader. Kills Two Moons listened, then considered for a moment. He then indicated, with a gesture of gathering and healing, that they would help. They possessed herbs, traditional medicines. The decision, when it finally came from Mary, was swift, born not of logic but of a fierce, primal instinct, a mother lion's unyielding ferocity to protect her young. "We will go with you," she declared, her voice surprisingly firm as she met Kills Two Moons' direct, unwavering gaze. An uneasy, unspoken alliance was forged in that moment, in the howling heart of a relentless blizzard, between four abandoned, desperate sisters and a band of stoic Comanche warriors, united by the shadow of a common, ruthless enemy and a universal, desperate human need for survival and justice. What happened next would irrevocably change not only their own fates, but the destiny of Redemption Gulch itself. The journey to the Comanche winter camp was an ordeal of endurance. Kills 2 Moons and his warriors, despite their intimidating appearance, handled Annie with surprising gentleness. The sick child was carefully bundled in furs and carried tenderly by one of the younger, stronger men. They quickly fashioned a rough travois from poles and hides for Emily, who was too weak from hunger and exposure to walk far. Mary and Sarah, their initial soul-crushing fear slowly yielding to a weary, grim determination, trudged through the deep, treacherous snow, supported by the stoic, silent presence of the warriors. The Comanches moved through the blizzard-ravaged landscape with an efficiency that awed Mary. They knew the land intimately, understood the capricious moods of the storm, and navigated its dangers with an almost animalistic instinct. The camp, when they finally reached it, was a collection of sturdy, conical teepees, nestled in a deep, sheltered ravine, smoke rising from their peaks in thin, welcoming plumes against the gray sky. The unexpected warmth inside the teepee they were given, the rich, savory smell of roasting meat, the unexpectedly concerned glances from the Comanche women who immediately set about tending to Annie with surprising tenderness and skill, all began to chip away at the thick layers of ingrained prejudice Mary had carried for so long. Kills 2 Moons, communicating through a warrior who possessed a more extensive, if still broken, command of English, questioned Mary carefully and patiently about her parents. He asked about their intended business in Redemption Gulch, about the man named Blackwood. Mary, her voice gaining strength and conviction as she spoke, told him everything she knew, of her parents' fierce determination to hold onto their land, of the unsettling rumors surrounding Blackwood's ruthless tactics. Sarah, her observant nature reasserting itself, now that the immediate threat had passed, added crucial details about unfamiliar, rough-looking strangers she had seen lurking near their valley in the weeks before her parents left, men who bore the unmistakable stamp of hired guns rather than honest settlers. The scattered pieces of the puzzle began to fit together into a sinister whole. Blackwood, it became clear, was systematically attempting to drive everyone, settlers through intimidation and violence, Comanches by disrupting their ancient way of life, off the valuable land he coveted. He aimed to claim vast swathes of territory for himself once it was, in his mind, empty. The brutal attack on the Carlsons was not an isolated incident of random savagery, but a calculated part of a larger, more nefarious plan. Kills 2 Moons listened intently, his dark eyes narrowed in thought. His own band had suffered unexplained losses recently. Winter stores mysteriously set ablaze, their hunting parties harassed by unseen marksmen. He recognized a pattern, and in the plight of these white girls, he saw not only a chance to offer aid, but also an opportunity to strike back at a common, destructive enemy. A plan began to form, forged in the quiet intensity of the teepee. Kills 2 Moons, with a small, hand-picked band of his most trusted warriors, would ride to Redemption Gulch. Mary, her resolve now hardened into something akin to cold steel, insisted on accompanying them. She knew Blackwood by sight. She could identify him. Sarah, though still weak from their ordeal, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective loyalty, also demanded to go. Her sharp memory for details and her knowledge of the area around their homestead potentially vital. Kills 2 Moons, after a moment of silent, thoughtful hesitation, agreed. He saw the unyielding fire in their eyes, the resilient spirit that had somehow kept them alive through the blizzard's fury. Emily and Annie, now under the watchful care of the Comanche women, would remain safe in the camp. The ride to Redemption Gulch was a tense, silent affair. Mary and Sarah, mounted on sturdy ponies provided by the Comanches, rode amidst the grim-faced warriors, a strange, almost surreal procession that would have undoubtedly terrified any unsuspecting onlooker. As they neared the raw, untidy cluster of clapboard buildings that constituted the town, huddled defensively against the snow-swept plains, Kills 2 Moons sent scouts ahead with his customary caution. They returned swiftly with intelligence. Blackwood was in the town's only saloon, carousing loudly with a group of rough-looking, heavily armed men, unmistakably his enforcers. The confrontation was not the wild, chaotic shootout Mary might have imagined. It was something far more unnerving, at least for Alistair Blackwood. Kills 2 moons, flanked by 2 of his most imposing warriors, with Mary and Sarah walking steadfastly, and with grim determination beside him, pushed open the swinging doors and entered the smoky, raucous saloon. Conversation and laughter died instantly, replaced by a sudden, shocked silence. Every eye in the crowded room turned to the stoic, formidable Comanches and the 2 pale, trail-worn, yet fiercely resolute young women who accompanied them. Blackwood, a portly, florid-faced man with small, avaricious eyes, was seated at a prominent table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him. His face visibly paled when he saw the intruders. Blackwood struggled to his feet, his hand instinctively dropping to the butt of the pistol holstered at his belt, his voice a blustering attempt at authority as he demanded what the meaning of this intrusion was. Kills 2 moons did not deign to reply. He simply looked at Blackwood with an expression of cold, profound contempt. It was Mary who spoke, her voice, though quiet, cutting through the tense silence with surprising clarity and strength. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her gaze unwavering, her chin held high. "We have come about our parents, Thomas and Martha Carlson." She then held up the small, carved wooden bird, its presence in this den of thieves a stark accusation. And she added about this. Blackwood's shifty eyes flickered to the bird, then to the grim, unyielding faces of the Comanches. He began to stammer a denial, a web of lies already forming on his lips, but Mary pressed on, her words falling like hammer blows, recounting the details of the ambush, describing the distinctive boot prints found at the scene, the stolen goods. Sarah, her voice sharp and certain, pointed directly to 2 of the hard-faced men at Blackwood's table, stating that their horses, she had seen horses, just like theirs skulking near their land days before her parents left. The accused men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting nervously, avoiding the collective gaze of the saloon. Then Kills 2 moons spoke, his English sparse, but his meaning delivered with powerful, unmistakable force. He spoke of the tracks his warriors had followed, of the lies that had been spun, of the dishonorable, cowardly attack on an unarmed man and woman. He spoke, too, of Blackwood's men causing trouble for his own people, disturbing their peace. The saloon remained utterly silent, the townsfolk hanging on every word. Many among them harbored their own deep-seated suspicions about Blackwood, their own bitter tales of his underhanded dealings, his relentless pressure tactics. Gradually, one by one, other settlers, emboldened by the unexpected arrival of the Comanches and the raw courage of Mary Carlson, began to find their own voices. A storekeeper spoke of credit unfairly called in, a rancher of fences mysteriously cut. The tide of public opinion, so long suppressed by fear, turned against Blackwood with the sudden, unstoppable force of a flash flood. His enforcers, seeing their master exposed and their own positions untenable, began to slink towards the door or found themselves suddenly surrounded by grim-faced, angry townsmen. Blackwood, his face a mask of apoplectic fury and dawning terror, was trapped. Frontier justice, rough and swift, was about to be served. The downfall of Alistair Blackwood was as swift as it was absolute. Faced with Mary's irrefutable testimony, the damning physical evidence presented by Kills 2 moons, and the sudden, explosive courage of the very townsfolk he had long bullied and intimidated, his arrogant bluster utterly collapsed. His paid thugs, sensing the dramatic shift in power, either scattered like rats deserting a sinking ship or were quickly and unceremoniously subdued by the newly emboldened citizens of Redemption Gulch, who seemed eager to purge their town of his corrupting, avaricious influence. Blackwood himself was seized, his loud cries of outrage and his desperate, empty threats falling on deaf ears. He would face whatever rough justice the frontier could hastily assemble, likely a swift trial and a long, harsh reckoning for his crimes. More importantly, and more urgently for Mary and Sarah, vital information regarding the fate of their parents finally came to light. One of Blackwood's captured enforcers, his bravado gone, now desperate for leniency, confessed under pressure that Thomas and Martha Carlson hadn't been killed outright, as was first feared. They had been badly beaten, robbed, and callously left for dead in a remote, snow-filled gully miles from their wrecked wagon. Kills 2 moons, his expression unreadable, but his actions characteristically decisive, immediately dispatched 2 of his most skilled warriors, with the now contrite and terrified thug reluctantly serving as their guide. A fragile, almost unbearable hope surged in Mary's bruised heart. Hours later, as a pale, hesitant dawn began to break over the vast, snow-covered plains, casting long, eerie shadows, the warriors returned. And with them, carried carefully on makeshift litters, were Thomas and Martha Carlson. They were alive, battered, frostbitten, perilously weak, but undeniably alive. An old, reclusive trapper, whose hidden cabin was nestled deep in the woods and who was known and trusted by the Comanches, had stumbled upon them by chance. He had taken them in, sharing his own meager supplies, his care just enough to keep them from succumbing entirely to the brutal elements. The reunion that followed was a raw, unfiltered outpouring of tears, relief, and profound gratitude, an emotional torrent that transcended the barriers of language and culture. The Carlson family, with Emily and a slowly recovering Annie joyfully retrieved from the Comanche winter camp, spent many weeks recuperating in Redemption Gulch. They were aided by townsfolk now eager to make amends for their earlier fear-induced passivity, offering food, shelter, and genuine kindness. Blackwood's elaborate schemes of land theft were entirely unraveled, his fraudulently obtained claims declared null and void. The Carlsons' deed to their small, fertile valley was officially, and this time undisputed under Sir L.Y., registered with the territorial authorities. Kills 2 moons and his warriors did not linger in the white man's town. Once they were satisfied that the Carlsons were safe, and that a measure of justice had taken its course, they prepared to depart. There were no grand pronouncements, no sentimental, drawn-out farewells. Kills 2 moons met Thomas Carlson's gaze, a silent, profound acknowledgment passing between 2 men from vastly different worlds, men who had, against all odds, found common ground in the face of a shared, despicable enemy. He then looked at Mary, and for a fleeting instant, a flicker of something akin to deep respect, perhaps even admiration, softened his stern, dark eyes. Then, with a subtle gesture, he turned his pony and led his band back towards their own ancestral lands, disappearing as quietly and enigmatically into the vastness of the prairie as they had first appeared out of the heart of the blizzard. The Carlson sisters were forever changed by their ordeal. They had faced the raw, brutal, indifferent heart of the frontier, and had not only survived, but had emerged stronger. Their survival was a testament not just to their own courage and resilience, but to an unexpected alliance forged in the crucible of a storm, with those they had been meticulously taught to fear and revile. The deep-seated fear of the Comanche, so carefully ingrained by their father's oft-repeated warnings, was replaced by a complex, nuanced tapestry of gratitude, wary respect, and a dawning understanding. The world, Mary now knew, was not simply black and white, its enemies and friends clearly and irrevocably defined. They had learned the hard lesson that savagery could often wear a civilized suit and polished boots, and that true honor, courage, and compassion could be found in the most unexpected of faces, under the most unlikely of circumstances. Their small, once terrifying cabin, when they finally returned to it, became not a reminder of their fear, but a symbol of their enduring resilience. The prairie wind still howled its lonely song across the plains. The winters were still harsh and unforgiving, but the Carlson family, stronger, wiser, and irrevocably bound together, knew they could face whatever came their way. For they had learned that even in the deepest, most terrifying blizzard, a single shocking move, an unexpected hand of help, could change everything, revealing that the human spirit, in its myriad, surprising, and often hidden forms, was truly the most formidable and enduring force on the long and dusty trail.